The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in two high-profile cases over whether states can ban transgender students from competing in girls' and women's sports. At the center, fairness, biology, and how far states can go under Title IX. Supporters say the law protects female athletes. Opponents argue they unfairly target transgender students.
We can't beat biology. As an athlete and a nursing major, it is absurd to suggest that it is fair to put men in women's sports. It's like racing a cheetah against an ocelot. Sure, they're both fast cats with spots, but we all know who is going to win.
I was just saying, I don't think that's what is at issue in this case. What's at issue in this case is fair treatment for all people, including cis people and trans people, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Georgia law currently limits participation in girls' and women's sports to biological females. State Attorney General Chris Carr put out a statement on the arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court, saying girls should not be forced to compete against boys, calling it basic science and common sense. So let's dive into this debate with noted legal scholar and professor of law at Georgia State, Eric Segall. Welcome to you. At its core, what is the Supreme Court actually being asked to decide in these cases?
So both of these states, like Georgia, has a law that prohibits trans women from competing in men's sports. And the issues in this case really are just, can states make a blanket rule about this? Or do states have to have a carve out for certain trans athletes? For example, some trans women took puberty blockers at a very early age and maybe don't have all of the genetic advantages that men on average have over women in sports. And the question is, can the states just act completely broadly and say no participation in women's sports for trans women, or do they have to be a little bit more specific and take into account kind of local circumstances?
And so what kind of stood out to you here most about the justices' tone during arguments?
Yeah, it was a pretty civil argument, all things considered, and I don't think there's much suspense. The Roberts Court is going to upheld these two laws, which will in turn mean Georgia's law is also constitutional. And I think this is the kind of issue that, generally speaking, should be left to the states. And here's what I mean by that. We've already decided as a society and as a matter of federal law that men have no right to play women's sports. Now, we could revisit that or not, but I don't think many people are interested these days in having a 6'5", 250-pound male play women's hockey, for example, and so on and so forth. So we've already decided segregated sports is fine, constitutional and legal, for all of the reasons that, males, generally speaking, are bigger and heavier and stronger, although there are certainly exceptions to that rule across the board. So then the question becomes, do we have to make an exception for people who were born with male biology at birth but now identify as women? And as a policy matter, I think it's a close call, and I think reasonable people can disagree on the answer to that question. The question before the Supreme Court is who decides? 9 lawyers sitting in Washington, or the states of Idaho and West Virginia and Georgia, or local school boards? And I have to say, I think the court was siding, it's pretty obvious, with the idea that states should decide this question. There's nothing in the Constitution that specifically speaks to it. And I have sympathy for that view. I'm not saying anything about the policy. I might vote for a different law than the one Georgia has. But as a constitutional law matter, it's pretty clear that law is going to be valid.
You think this is more about sports or about how the law defines sex under Title IX?
Well, that's fair, and there's two different issues. One is the Constitution, one is this federal law. But this federal law already allows men to be not to compete in women's sports. The question is, do we make an exception for that for trans women? No, this is obviously a culture war issue. In fact, one of the women in these two cases says she's not going to play any more sports and wants the case dismissed. She was the original plaintiff. The other, in West Virginia, there's one woman in the entire state that this law applies to. I don't know how many athletes there are in Georgia, but I know there are very, very few. The Supreme Court took this case because lower courts had struck down these laws. I do think, obviously, the trans issue is being used by the current administration as a culture war type of issue. But then again, we have to decide, do we want trans women playing female sports in high schools and colleges? And I just think that's a tough issue, and how I would vote is irrelevant. I don't think either the Constitution or Title IX provides an answer to that question. I think states are allowed to come up with their own answers to that question, even if I personally might disagree with those answers.
All right. Well, we thank you for kind of breaking that down for us today. This is an issue that we'll be all watching closely, especially here in Georgia.